Start. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, friends of freedom, friends of the Freedom Games, one of the most exciting events that I actually know. I can say this as somebody who has been visitor for several times. Our topic this evening, well, until 1989, my home country, Germany, that's where I come from originally, was an experimental field to compare capitalism and socialism. And so it was also a field of experimentation in environmental protection. And the comparison produced clear results. No country in the world emitted as much sulfur dioxide and dust as the German Democratic Republic, as it was called. In 1988, 313 kilos of SO2 and 132 kilos of dust were released per inhabitant a year, 17 times as much as in Western Germany at the time. This created, of course, dire health problems for the population. The GDR was also world champions in terms of carbon dioxide emissions with 21 tons per inhabitant. And at the same time, it contributed little to its degradation because, for instance, 54% of the forest area was damaged in 1989. And not only this, 70% of the major rivers in the GDR were no longer allowed to be used for drinking water. I'm sure that in Poland you can tell very similar stories, or I know that you can tell stories. You could go on like this for a long time. Nevertheless, we can see that today's climate and environment policy discussions see a renewed belief in planned economy instruments. And we may ask the questions, is the market economy sufficient to solve the problems? Sections of the climate movement at the time, perhaps not the majority, do not shy away, at least in Western Germany, from wearing communist symbols on their demonstrations. Hammer and sickle have made a comeback. And environmental protection, in their view, only seems to come at the cost of overthrowing capitalism. But can this be a solution in historical perspective? Are such ideas supported by economic theory, which is, I think, something we should take into account? Is there an insurmountable contradiction between a liberal market economy and a protected environment? And to clarify these questions, we have four of them are here at the moment, experts, competent experts, whom I like to introduce briefly. Begin with Professor Jan Schnellenbach. He is professor of microeconomics, so an economist at Brandenburg University of Technology since 2014, and he has taken part in many parliamentary hearings about European climate policies, usually nominated there in these commissions by the German liberals. We have Agnieszka Pomaska. She's a member of parliament, vice chairperson of the European Union Affairs Committee, and former vice chairman of Gdansk City Council, and she's member of parliament since 2009. Seems to be not with us yet, but I hope she will appear. Casey Pfeiffer of the Atlas Network from the US. She may drop in later, and Małgorzata Tracz, I hope I pronounced the name properly. She's co-president of the Green Party in Poland. And in November 2019, she became one of the first members of the Green Party to be elected to the Polish parliament. Last but not least, Radovan Durana. He is an economic policy analyst at the Institute of Economic and Social Studies, INES, in Slovakia, a long-standing partner of the organization that I represent, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. And he has been a member of the advisory council of the Minister of Finance and other government agencies, and a staunch free marketeer. So in my introduction, I was just concerned more with the historical side and the failures of communism, but we should, I think, now enter in a more a more constructive phase where we outline solutions more for the future. And so in the beginning, I will ask all the panelists one and the same question, and then later, if time is there, open a short discussion. Each panelist has, I would say, maximum of 10 minutes. When the time draws to a close, I will make a sign, just 1 minute. I see you can't probably not read it, but you know, if I wave something around, then you have to come to an end. And here's my question. How do you think the efficiency of the market economy could be used for environmental and moreover to climate policy? And rather randomly, I would start with Radovan Durana. Please, you have the chair.
So, hello, thank you, Detmar, and I'm happy that I can, I think it's the second time I can take part at the Igrzysk Wolności. I'm really sorry that I cannot be there personally because I enjoyed the place in Łódź and people in there. But let's get back to your important question. It can be framed with the words that were used by Leszek Barcelowicz, who says, are we talking about environmental statism or are we going to talk about market environmentalism? For any defender of free markets, and I consider myself as a defender of free market, definitely the second option is the one that is attractive. And I just remember the famous bet of Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, where they were discussing the amount of natural resources we have to use. And that was famous bet. Julian Simon won, and he won the bet twice. And it shows us that when we are talking about the climate change or any environmental problem, we should always think about three strategies. Martin Gundinger mentioned or named these three strategies as mitigation, adaptation, or reversal. Mitigation is something that the European Union is currently doing and is trying to eliminate the carbon so that the temperature will not rise. The adaptation is a strategy that says that it is cheaper, or maybe it makes more sense to adapt to change climate temperature, and it can be less expensive. And reversal is a third step or third scenario that allows or heavily relies on technological progress, which will make it possible to reverse the climate change. Now, any discussion about climate policy should begin with the decision which of these scenarios are we talking about. Because it seems that in European Union, the mitigation is the main scenario and adaptation is very far back, and reversal is not accepted at all. And I think that also our discussion should reflect this political reality. And then the options for markets are a little bit limited. Despite I'm a fan of free markets, I just cannot get over one important thing that I will describe on the taxing carbon. You probably know that the European trading system generates some kind of price of the ton of carbon, which is about 25 to 30 euro. Nevertheless, trading with allowance permits with all its rules in European Union does not automatically mean that emissions are in decline in a given sector. And as a matter of fact, European Commission forcefully limits the amount of tons that can be emitted. Otherwise, the price would be too low and have no effect. But International Monetary Fund, World Bank, many institutions or many economists are trying to calculate the costs of carbon that would lead to decreased production of it. But think about the fuel tax. It is called fuel tax, but as a matter of fact, we should treat this tax as a carbon tax. It's a consumption tax, and it does what carbon tax should do. It limits the consumption, and the fuel tax in the European Union is especially high. And I was trying to calculate the Slovak fuel tax, and for the petrol is about 220 euro, and for the diesel is 137 euro, the carbon tax. So one can say, fuels are heavily taxed already today, so we should not think about any other carbon tax on fuels, especially. But on the other hand, even the tax 220 euro per ton of CO2 does not eliminate the consumption of it. It just decreases the consumption of it, and the consumption remains rather stable. And in countries like Slovakia, it increases as the economic growth increases. So there is often mentioned argument against free market attitude that with growing wealth, wealthier people are spending more money, and in the effect they are emitting more carbon because they can afford it. So the question is if carbon tax itself can bring us to a lower amount of tons emitted, and it may not happen. And therefore, I personally expect that European bureaucrats are going to set the limits of tons of emitted carbon in near future, trying to bring European economy to a neutral state. So even in this case, we still have some space for market environmentalism. And I would appreciate if the governments just set the limit and let the entrepreneurs find a way to reach the limit with the most efficient way. We need entrepreneurs to find the solutions because governments don't have them now. We need a system of incentives that would reward those who can sequester CO2, whether it's carbon storage systems or via nature or via any other systems. That would kind of really move resources collected from any carbon taxes to technologies that decrease the tons of carbon emitted. Because currently the biggest problem of the fuel tax is that it is not used for any environmental issues at all. It is not used for compensation of people suffering from dirty environment or any environmental projects. It's just used for any government policies you can imagine. The second thing is that such policies like the limits on CO2 per kilometer per cars, which are often negatively commented from European car makers, and I can understand why. Such a policy at the end of the day may not be that bad because it is exactly what I said, that it's just setting limits and letting the entrepreneurs find the way to fulfill the limit. Of course, there is a problem of the international movement of carbon. The carbon does not care about if it's German, Slovak, or Finnish, or even Chinese. And from this perspective, any policies in European Union, I think, should reflect what's happening in the world. And I think if China says that the climate neutrality would be reached as early as in 2060, then current a rush in Brussels, or I call it a green race, like let's decrease it by 55% in 2030, or even by 60% in 2030, does not make too much sense. And from the history, we know that the technological progress can change things faster than politicians can imagine. And we can see it on the prospects of the cost of solar energy, which dropped heavily, and it's hard to imagine that politicians, even political agency, could not expect such a huge and fast drop. So let me finish my short comments on it. I'm skeptic on the thing that market itself can eliminate carbon emissions, and we would not probably get to carbon neutrality fast enough. On the other hand, the government should be clear in goals and use as little as few policies as possible, and let the markets and entrepreneurs find the best ways to meet the goals set by the government.
Yeah, thank you very much. It somehow means as much government as necessary, as much market as possible. You come from a think tank network, but there are the practitioners who have to legislate and have some confinements there. And I would be excited to hear Mrs. Pomaska, how you would respond to the question. Can markets help climate and the environment?
Thank you very much. I would like to make it clear, should I speak English or Polish? Is it translated to you? Because I think the majority of the listeners are Polish, so should I switch to
You can get English translation, you can speak Polish.
That's perfect, because I think that most of the listeners are with Polish origin. So let me switch into Polish. Wolny rynek.
Free market and eco-policy, friends or foes? Well, when I saw the question, I found it provocative. For me, the green policy, environmental protection issues are so close to my heart. I'll tell you why, how come, what aspects. But I found it provocative, and that's okay, because provocative questions make you think deeper. Obviously, for a person who is an MP and is in the environmental issues, it's obvious that the environmental protection is for us opportunity, but also opportunity for businesses, for free market. But we are aware that as MPs, I'm a member of the opposition, which I need to stress, the governing party should treat environmental protection as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. As I understand, we are not here to discuss the policy of the Polish government, though I have the feeling that the more developed countries, richer countries, were faster to find opportunities brought by various green businesses or green policies, that these can be good business and they can stimulate business and economy. That is why I'm always sorry to hear that Poland is still facing this important choice, or perhaps that in Poland, the environmental protection issues are not that important for our voters to become an essential item of the election campaign. But that time will come. Poland is getting richer and richer, and we should observe the countries for which the environmental protection is used for the economy, for the free market. The way I see environmental protection is something that needs to be regulated, stimulated, and directions needs to be set forth. Obviously, we mustn't disturb. The situation in Poland is that conditions for the development of green businesses are far from satisfactory, and quite often they suffer because the topic of ecology, environmental protection is political topic, but not in big terms, in setting goals, climatic goals. Though some parties, my party included, said, but that is perceived as political rhetoric. Let me explain. Today, being somebody who supports green technologies is stigmatized by the current governing parties. Well, you support green technologies, that means you ride a bike, you are against the miners, you don't want Poland to develop. That's such a framework with enormous harm to all of us, primarily for the economy. I wanted to explain that to our foreign guests, why Poland cannot go ahead with green issues, because we are hostage to the national politics, the government propaganda that stigmatizes green businesses and the development of economy by investing in modern technologies. You all well know that the Polish government, not Poland, but the current Polish government is the brake for setting the climatic goals, though I believe that internal pressure from Polish citizens will be increasing. Finally, I need to share my personal experience. Why have I turned to environment issues so much? It all started with the symbolic straw. If you remember, it all started 3 years ago. This famous motive of a scientist who posted a film of a straw taken out of a turtle's throat, and anti-plastic movement was triggered then in Europe. I also had this health aspect for that, and I opened in the parliament a team for named Give Up Plastic, and we found that a niche, an occupied niche in businesses, the manufacture of multi-use bags, non-plastic straws, zero waste ideas, the idea of not wasting food. All these exist in the business space and need to be managed. And it is happening. Things are becoming fashionable. There is a demand, and you do not need huge legal regulations, though the government could help. But you don't need those legislation to make the free market work so that everybody benefits from that. So we have new businesses that are seen as green. But at the same time, we see that at the very end of those small businesses, we have a sum of changes in the environmental protection translating into climate changes, though we know that climate changes are more difficult to touch, to measure, and that is why people find it difficult to understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, I didn't even have to give you a warning time. You were absolutely precise. Wonderful. If I put it in a nutshell, in Poland, it seems to be not only the question whether it's market-oriented or not market-oriented environment policy. It's simply it's a break on every sort of environmental policy, including productive business solutions. If I've got it right, which I think is already playing the ball to our next speaker, Mrs. Tracz. I suppose you would probably not totally disagree.
Witam serdecznie, bardzo dziękuję za zaproszenie i niezwykle cieszy mnie, że ten dzisiejszy panel poświęcony jest przede wszystkim...
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm very happy to see this panel dedicated to environmental policies and fight with climate change. We are facing pandemic times, some limitations related to pandemics. But what is around the corner is another crisis, the climate crisis that is on everybody's lips for years. However, not always do we tackle this properly. What we are facing at the moment is the need to have a different line of thinking, to depart from this kind of paradigm that this is a good or bad free market, good or bad national solutions. We need to change this political paradigm. Question of crisis. This history perspective lets us see that if we ignore global warming, emissions of greenhouse gases and climate change, and allowance for big oil companies has led us to the point we are in. For 55 years, 20 biggest oil companies have emitted 30% of all greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So let's not think that all kinds of activities, apart from those at the European level or global level, including those at the European Union, will change this kind of attitude, because there is this concept that income should be privatized, but the cost should be transferred onto the citizens and consumers. And this is what we have been facing. It's not like all activities that the state takes up are good and proper ones. So, for example, from the point of view of Poland, in 2013, 2019, the state subsidized conventional energy generation based on fossil fuels with 30 billion Polish zlotys. At the same time, the development of RESs, renewable energy sources and similar, had less than 50% of the sum earmarked. So there's yet another example of bad action of the state. So this is another act that blocks the development of wind energy on land. I am not going to say that state or international activities are good and the free market is bad, but I believe that we need to find the green middle way and recognize what is good in this kind of initiative regarding free market, especially SME sector, and the state should safeguard introduction of regulations that on the one hand push the biggest corporations that do not feel the results of climate change because they operate in this part of the world that is not influenced. Therefore, torrential rains or droughts, iceberg melting and increased level of seas and oceans have not yet been discovered by these companies. On the other hand, the state has to create regulations that support the free market initiatives rather than to block them. Returning to concrete examples, there's a concrete example, direct investments. We can see that all over the world, mainly in the United States, we have seen the transfer from large companies to startups. Startups that operate in innovative technology sector, which make it possible to tackle with the questions of PV generation, as mentioned before. The price of PV panels over the number of years has decreased owing to innovative activities, which made it possible for greater development of PV sector. So what should we do in this case? The state should support by giving more subsidies for research and development and develop the startups and the companies that work on innovations and innovative technologies. And another tool in this respect, green taxes. In Germany, we've got a whole array of green tax reform in place, and there is one of the tools, taxation on electricity or emissions of greenhouse gases, incineration of fossil fuels. Look and see, there is this kind of paradox where aviation market is exempt from taxes, practically speaking. So it is subsidized by the cost of railway transport, which is more ecological, and that might provide a future development. So green taxes, so kind of state activities that would be in aid to finance green innovativeness. And there is yet another example that I wish to share. Prosumers. In Poland, there is a number of small micro PV installations. And we have exquisite attitude towards renewable energy because this is based on prosumers' idea, dispersed energy generation. And market mechanisms are in place when PV panels are becoming cheaper and cheaper, when we have something that should be praised. So the incentives from the state, My Generation program, this is a small subsidy to RES civic installations up to 5,000 Polish zlotys. Only then we can see that the state gives this prod that results in a greater number of installations in place. In Poland, we've got a system of the auctions that is designed to support renewable energy sources, which is also a kind of mechanisms that makes it possible for the prosumer's energy to become more proliferate. And we have the third element, informed consumers. Agnieszka Pomaska gave you an insight to this. There's a greater and greater awareness that these kind of pro-ecological and pro-climate activities may be started by consumers. This is us. And consumers' choices make it possible for RESs to try to be in line with the needs of us consumers with respect to food production that has got small carbon print. We speak about green ecological food or locally produced food. The same applies to cosmetics, which also observe appropriate ecological standards. In this respect, the state's role is very important, and this is the state role to educate climate-wise, which is missing in Poland, which would result in a greater number of informed consumers. And there is the role of the state, or even self-government, is related to green public procurement. So the procurement documents are created so that not only financial aspects are taken into consideration, but also the social ones. So, for example, we've got Turku in Finland. There is a specific requirement for offices with regards to city lights and office lights, which results in a smaller carbon print and better ecological solutions. So I believe that we need to depart from this black and white perception of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Look and see the green policy, green politicians, and free market are not your enemies. De facto, these can be our allies if we develop the right regulations, which give the biggest burden to those who do not change the paradigms, who are the polluters, because they keep fighting for financial gains, which they find the most important. What about the regulations that support free market solutions that operate properly rather than to block them? And there is one more thing on top of that, which is also of utmost importance for us, the green politicians, the civic democracy and civic society. We know that people are pretty entrepreneurial, they generate lots of ideas. They have ecological and economical issues, but they assume a broader perspective. They assume decade-long perspective, the good of their children and grandchildren that will come in the decades to come, not only the one terms of office when they sit in the parliament. There is a very good solution that we would put very high on the ranking list are the climate civic panels at the level of a country rather than the city, although the municipal panels are also very important with regards to green issues. We've got examples from France or Great Britain or UK, where we have the green civic panels. People give and offer very good solutions, which then can be implemented by the state through appropriate regulations. our debate to support climate, our debate to support pro-climatic policies should be directed into market regulations so that we are joined by a common goal between the states, international organizations, EU, and entrepreneurs, SMEs, and us, prosumers, so that we can act hand in hand for the benefit of the environment, to lower the emissions, to fight climate crisis, so that we find the green middle way that is very much needed in the difficult times.
You landed on the spot. Thank you very much indeed. I see the middle way, and you also mentioned Germany as an example. Usually Germany is seen as a country that is most advanced in policies. You reminded us that with fuel for aircraft, this is not necessarily the case. And with that, we could enter some, let's say, advice from Germany. Professor Schnellenbach.
Yes, thank you, Detmar. I think many important points have already been made, so I'll just add a few brief further comments. I think when we discuss whether markets are necessary to deal with climate change and a greening of the economy, then would be clearly my first statement that markets are definitely necessary to reach our green goals that we have policy-wise. There are several reasons for that. The first reason is, of course, efficiency. And there's no mechanism that helps to deal with climate change as efficient as markets. Our goal has to be to save CO2 emissions where it's most easy to save them, where it's most cost efficient to save them. And only markets can direct us in a way that we save CO2 emissions where it's most cost efficient to do so. So we need probably an emission trading system, a unified emission trading system in Europe to deal with climate change and to do it in the most efficient way. But these allocative questions are static questions, and there are also more dynamic questions. And one is, of course, technology. And Radovan already mentioned that we might, for example, need CO2 mitigating technologies, that we might need new technologies to draw CO2 from the atmosphere. And the only framework to develop those new technologies efficiently is, of course, a market economy. We can't do it without a dynamically growing market economy. We probably won't get these new technologies out of government-directed research systems, but markets will play a major role in getting us to these new technologies. So that's another aspect where we need markets. And of course, we also need markets because environmental protection is, if we are honest to ourselves, a luxury good. You begin to think about saving the environment when other basic needs are already taken care of. So in order to deal with a global environmental problem like climate change, it's very important that we have growth, especially in the emerging and developing economies, in order to make these economies, to put these economies into a situation where they can afford climate change and where they will be willing to invest substantial resources into stopping climate change. So in this sense, growth markets are, I think, very important to deal with the environmental issues that are upon us now. But of course, and that's the bad news for our libertarian friends, is that markets can't do it alone. Markets are necessary, but not sufficient. So you need some government regulation. You need, for example, a unified European emission trading system. You need border controls that correct for CO2 emissions for imports and exports and things like that. So there is a substantial role for government to play because there are externalities and global externalities that need to be taken care of. And there's no way that you can do this in a decentralized way. You need governments to set the right incentives. You need governments to set up these emission trading systems. And I would actually very much advocate having an emission trading system instead of carbon tax, because the trading system allows you to steer the quantity directly, and you don't have to set a price, an efficient price at first, but you can determine straightforward which quantity of CO2 emissions you want in the atmosphere and which you can tolerate in a given year in the atmosphere. You can credibly commit to paths of CO2 emissions for the future, and that already again sets new incentives for innovations, for technology developments in the private sector. So that's, I think, what we should do politically. We should set up a unified emission trading system which includes all sectors of the European economy, and that will set the right incentives for the market to respond efficiently to the challenge of climate change. But that leads to the third and final point I'd like to make. I think the challenge is that, especially from a classical liberal perspective, the challenge is that we are in a situation where we need to grant governments new responsibilities for regulation. But the challenge is to limit these responsibilities and to make sure that governments won't encroach into the market system and into individual liberties too far. And that's a real danger, I think, because we have currently these discussions about degrowth, about a post-growth economy, about implementing alternative models of economic organization, alternative models to a market economy. And that would clearly go much too far. And we need to limit this newly found interest in government regulation, because that's a very, very limited, healthy degree of additional government regulation, and we shouldn't let it escalate too far. And that will be a challenge for democracies in the future, I think, to still stick to a market economy in the face of governments being trusted with new responsibilities. Okay, that's my points, and I think we should discuss our starting statements.
Thank you very much for that. So we have a few minutes left, so I should give everyone a chance to respond, or maybe I could start also with my questions. But start from the beginning again. Radovan, there was talk of the middle way and certain regulations. Do you feel a danger in all this, or do you have a more radical approach, or where would be the principle where you would limit government intervention?
Well, I think that the answer on this question depends on how much do you agree with the scientific conclusions regarding the necessary outcome of the carbon. Whether the carbon is going to accumulate in the atmosphere and there will be then no change to reverse the situation or not. So if we accept the proposition that it's not possible to reverse the situation from certain point, and that from some point in near future we will not be able to control the growth of climate temperature, then we have to accept the role of the government for setting the limits. I very much agree with Professor Schnellenbach, what he said about the trading system, which is the best way to find the solutions. But there is one problem with the ETS, and it's a government treasury, because government wants money, and the trading system might not generate sufficient money for the government. So I'm afraid that we will end up with both carbon tax and trading system, whether we like it or not.
That's pessimistic news. So we shouldn't be have our countries run by politicians, but by principled economists, I would say. Yes, probably there's no political question where we can stop greed for money. What, Mrs. Pomaska, what do you think would be the first your government does? I mean, the Polish government has a certain reputation of being more or less environmentalist than others. What would you think would be the first measure if you would be there instead of Mr. Morawiecki and say the first thing I do in my office to do something very positive, efficiently for the environmental policy? What would you think is, yeah?
Po pierwsze,
First and foremost, the problem that we have in Poland with Poland's government, the government does not think in the categories of what will happen in 10, 20 or 30 years' time. This is very short-sighted. This is the problem of many governments. And I believe that the political parties that win elections with the green agenda find the golden mean or the green mean, green middle way. They think long-term perspective. However, they are able to reach people with this communication. And I believe this is the question of more robust education. Let me clarify one thing. Małgorzata Tracz is a member of the parliamentary club I'm a member of. The Green are a very strong part of the coalition, the biggest opposition party in Poland today. And Civic Platform, the party that used to be headed by Donald Tusk, has undergone a specific evolution. We keep changing. Sometimes we are charged with this. We have supported the mining system at some time. We pumped a lot of money at a specific time. Not always was the money spent efficiently. From the time perspective, we can say this, but there is no doubt about it. Poland needs to find its own way to give up on coal. We cannot just do the lip service. Being a member of the European Union in the context of the chances that the European Union gives when it comes to energy policy change is of utmost importance for us. What my government would do, as I see it, I would try to talk our European partners into helping countries like Poland, which depend on coal more than other countries, so that Poland would be the country you want to invest in. You want to invest in cutting-edge technologies, green energy. And I think this sets the basis. You need to think about what happens in 10 or 20 years' time, not only in Poland, but first and foremost, what happens in Europe. This is the category we need to think. And we need to invest more funds into green energy. And at the same time, we need to indicate the mining sector that has been a burden. At the end of the day, there are people who work in the mining sector because we need to make choices, we need to make political decisions. And this translates to electoral decisions. So the regions that depend on mining should be indicated that the change with regards energy policy, a departure from coal in order to use cutting-edge technologies is also a chance for them. In a shorter perspective, it means clean air, healthier children. You don't need to pay a visit to a doctor that often. So I believe this is the challenge that we are facing at the moment. And I believe this is the moment to show it when getting ready for the next election. We need to remember that we need to convince people to your rationale at the end of the day. We need to convince most of the voters that we are right. If we are right, if we are unable to turn it into a success, it's a failure. And that's the way it is today.
Thank you very much. I'm still thinking of a remark by Professor Schnellenbach, and so my question to Mrs. Tracz. I know Greens from Germany. I live long enough now in Central Europe, and to see that Greens there are usually a little bit different given the historical background also. There's less of a naivety of towards certain socialist policies. So Green Party obviously is rather a centrist party, if I got you right, Mrs. Pomaska. And I remember saying, yes, what we need worldwide, Professor Schnellenbach said, is in certain countries growth, and if we don't have that, we may not save the environment. I think if I would turn up at a Green Party conference in Germany with that, I would go out with a black eye afterwards. What do you think about that?
To jest bardzo ciekawe pytanie. No, my jesteśmy jako Partia Zielonych.
This is a very interesting question. We are a part of the European Green family. We are part of the European Party, and we've got the programs that are similar, especially when we talk about human rights questions and the questions regarding renewable energy sources and economy. I know that the Greens have been perceived as a leftist party. However, we've got our green agenda, green program that skips this kind of division to the left, middle, and right wing. These are the solutions that are good for the climate and for the people. We have cooperated with the German Greens, and I believe that what brings us together is our attitude. We cannot chase the rabbit all the time. It's not like Poland that needs to go exactly the same way as the European Union countries from the West did, that we need to climb the same steps of the development ladder. Otherwise, we'll not be able to make up for the losses. That's the greater challenge. Some of the phases that is about to finish in Western Europe, especially when we speak about conventional energy generation that is based on fossil fuels, needs to be covered much faster here in Poland, so that at the end of the day, we are at par. And at the end of the day, jointly as the European Union, we're able to fight for the climate, fight against the catastrophe. This is not easy, but I can see a great chance, well, a smaller chance in this political situation, but a normal situation at the pan-European level. Poland is the only country in Europe that has not declared a neutrality goal. And at the same time, we kind of seem to boast that we have this kind of climate discount. But as a matter of fact, in a long-term perspective, this kind of attitude will be against us. The more so that we have lots of European Union money under the mechanism, the transformation mechanism. Poland is lagging behind. We fall behind because we need to have specific plans and declarations in place so that we depart from coal. Only 3 regions in Poland have applied for the European Union money from the transformation funds. Wielkopolska, Silesia, and Lower Silesia. What is interesting, Lower Silesia is the post-coal area, Wałbrzych area, which has undergone the transformation. Many mines have been closed down quite drastically in the 90s. Lots of people lost their jobs. However, there are lots of other regions in Poland that need to transform still. Polish government is quite obstinate. They do greenwashing. On the one hand, officially they support energy, but they are unable to walk the talk because they introduce regulations which make it possible for open pits to carry on working, and they don't even have to apply for the permit extension because it's done automatically. What is interesting here is Turów mine that is close to my heart because I live in my region, Bogatynia. As a matter of fact, this is the problem at the border of Poland, Czechia, and Germany, where Poland is trying to excavate coal, brown coal in this place, and 30,000 of citizens in Czechia are deprived of water. The Liberec county is deprived of water, and we need to think about further initiatives to aid them. So Poland should give more, should chop in, should be a part of the declarations in Europe in climate policies, become neutral climate-wise. And at the same time, Poland will be able to gain more in order to depart from open pit mines and bet on green energy that gives stable workplaces and development for SMEs at the same time. This is something we need to remember about.
Thank you very much. We have very brief time now, Professor Schnellenbach. There were many tools discussed, from subsidies to all sorts of green taxes, and of course the European trading system. From Germany, a good example, our German energy tax system is a complicated one.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could sketch in 2 minutes or so, perhaps how things can go wrong, or if you think so.
Yes, I mean, things can go wrong terribly, as you can see in the German energy tax system, because actually it's not a unified system, and that's the problem with this kind of energy tax system that we have in Germany. It's not a unified system to tax externalities, and that's what we would need right now. We would need a system that taxes externalities in a unified way in all kinds of channels of energy we might use. So we need to have a CO2 tax that internalizes this externality, regardless of the kind of energy we use. And the problem we have, for example, in the German system right now is that our electrical power is very expensive due to these energy taxes. And that's, of course, the most inefficient incentive that you can have at the moment, because the goal in terms of getting to CO2 neutrality would be to switch many kinds of energy to green electrical power, to come from fossil fuels to green electrical power, from renewable energies. That would be the goal. And with our current system that we have, we are taxing energy as such, and we are having very high taxes on electrical power, and that makes the transition very difficult to green electrical power. And that's a very, very unfortunate set of incentives that we have there. And we probably have to reform the whole system that we have at the moment. So yeah, given the time, the lack of time that we have now, I think, again, I think the most important point for policymakers would be not to entangle themselves in many different schemes and get lost in many different, sometimes contradicting schemes of policymaking, but look for a unified system, like a CO2 emission trading system that coherently taxes and internalizes the externalities that stem from CO2 emissions. And that would be probably the most efficient and most rational way to deal with this issue.
Thank you again. Thank you to everyone. I think we had a fine discussion. The only problem being it's a little bit too short given the topic. I found it was refreshingly non-ideological, and if we could have continued with it a little bit longer, I think we could have produced some very positive result. Important is that environmental policy should not go at the expense of freedoms and prosperities. I hope that next year this discussion can be continued in real physical, non-digital freedom games in Łódź, and I'm really looking forward to. And again, thank you to all of you as speakers, everybody who has organized it, and I hope all the people we couldn't see, the audience, found it interesting, as interesting as I found it with you. And with that, I use the last seconds to wish you a pleasant evening, and you can watch other discussions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Detmar.